Hi, Frans.
Hello, Greg. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for making another go at this video. We tried recently, but there were a number of issues with the video, and I'm really excited that we can keep the momentum going and just push forward with another video.
Yes.
So let's jump straight into it and start with, I think my first question was why the title South Africa Can Work. It's a very interesting title.
Yes, well, there are two reasons. Many years ago, one of the people who published a previous book, which dealt with labor relations and labor law, made the very profound suggestion that I should write a book with the title South Africa Can Work. And it immediately struck a chord because I thought it has two meanings. South Africa can work means to me that South Africa functions as it should function. Everything works, the machine works in that sense of the word, which is obviously what we all want. But I also thought that in my life as a labor lawyer, I have happened to stumble on what I believe is ultimately the most important problem to South Africans. There's a survey that I quote in the first chapter that says unemployment is but far and away the most important problem for ordinary South Africans. Something like 59% of ordinary South Africans say unemployment is the biggest problem. So we can look at the causes of that, but if you really want to address what bothers people, that is it.
And that's a study from the Institute of
the South African Institute of Race Relations. They did it in 2015, and incidentally, what it shows is that race is the most important problem in about 4% of people's lives. It completely debunks the myth that race is tearing South Africa apart. Although I should say that race is a topic which I tackle very thoroughly in the first two chapters of the book. So it's not as if I leave it aside, but I fundamentally say it's an economic problem. It's a split between, to use the hackneyed phrase, the haves and the have-nots. That is our real difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, often it seems that race kind of dominates the discourse, but it seems that that's something of a red herring because it doesn't really get to the heart of the issue, which your book argues is unemployment,
and poverty,
education,
and education. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are structures in our society that are keeping the races apart. And those structures I summarize by using the word rent-seeking, a word which is not often familiar in ordinary language. People are not familiar with what it means, so I have sort of found a number of ways to express that. And one of it is simply to say, to some extent, it means getting something for nothing.
Rent-seeking.
Rent-seeking means getting something for nothing, either in full or in part. Another way of saying it is a couple of good old South African expressions. The one is the gravy train.
Yeah.
We all understand what that means. You get on and you ride the system, getting out of it without putting in productivity. The key word here is productivity. So come back to the thought which I raised earlier of unemployment. It is not just unemployment that's the problem. It's fundamentally unemployment that is not productive. Right. So we have to be productive.
And so when you say productive, I mean that to someone older, to someone familiar with the economy, that word obviously they take it for granted. Yes. But for younger audiences watching this video who want to understand these problems, what does it mean to be productively employed?
All right, let me say this as a starting point. The purpose of labor is to produce goods and services. You have to make something or do something that helps someone. Now, of course, most employment does that, but when you want to say that it is less productive, what you mean is that in relation to what it could be, it produces less. And also when you're looking at the contract, which is really at its heart an exchange of labor for wages.
Right.
It means that you are producing less for the wage that you receive.
Right.
Then we would also say that is not productive. It's although it produces something, it produces less. Right. So that dichotomy, unfortunately, lies at the heart of what is wrong with South Africa, in my view.
So I thought that an interesting approach in this video would be to sort of unpack the introduction and kind of so that we could create a video that almost enables people, gives people a sort of toolbox which they can use to understand the later videos that we make, which explore later chapters in more detail.
Yes.
So I think it'd be great if we could start at the beginning of that introduction, before we move on to the meatier topics, and start with that wonderful story of that Mexican dinner that you were having with your family.
Yeah,
because that's where it all starts.
I have to say the story is famous or notorious depending on your point of view. But my two sons, Daniel and Stefan, whom you know, had dinner with me, and we were at this Mexican restaurant, and I made the point, or they made the point, that the fees must fall movement must be resolved in favor of free tuition. And I then said, well, you should blame the ANC government because they're mismanaging the economy. That's the real problem.
Right.
So we started talking about the economy of South Africa, and it soon turned out, in fact, what Stefan said was a shock to my system. He said to me,
right.
I used to believe the stuff that you told us, but I no longer do. Trickle-down economics don't work. That was a blow to the stomach, as I describe it in the book. And in short order, the second blow was when they both calmly informed me that they intended voting for the EFF. And most people are very amused when I tell them the story.
Right.
But it's not entirely funny. The reason being that it struck me at that point in time that perhaps my two sons, in fact I'm pretty sure my two sons are not alone. They are very typical of a generation of young people in South Africa who have grown up on a diet of what I can best define as socialism. That there's an honest belief that the only way we will solve the problems of South Africa is through socialism. And I thought to myself, have I completely failed through all these years in conveying my arguments to them? I had always thought before that incident that my point was made very clearly, and it clearly hadn't been. And I decided, well, this is time now. I must put my thoughts on paper. Step back, re-examine the evidence, re-examine my premises, and start over. So that's where the book started.
I see.
In a practical sense.
Right. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I took such an interest in it is because obviously I'm a very close friend of Daniel's, and I really felt like even though in the introduction you mentioned that you were writing the book very much for them, and in some sense I identified with that as well. And so the book really, I think that's why the book really spoke to me, because I really feel like I could sense that you were trying to teach younger people something as well. Yeah.
Yes, I definitely wanted to, and one of the things which occurred to me was well, by now it should be no surprise that I'm saying that I propose free markets. The book is also titled South Africa Can Work, How a Free Market and Decentralized Government Will Make Us a Winning Nation. So there are two broad themes. It's a free market and then decentralized government, which I'm sure we'll just unpack a little bit a little later on. But free market is at least a half of the book. So it is a cornerstone. And it struck me that this notion, which had been so familiar to me all these years, is probably not understood.
The idea of a free market?
The idea of a free market is something that, although people think they understand, they don't really. And that is one of the problems that I tackle in the book.
I think this is a nice opportunity to discuss freedom, because in the introduction, after that story about the Mexican dinner, you move on to the importance of freedom, freedom of thought, freedom in your writing, so could you explain how freedom features in this book?
I did a lot of introspection. Book is partly about looking inside myself, because how can I go and preach to the young people, and more in particular to black people out there, as a white privileged male, if I'm not at least getting my own internal house, my thinking in order. Right. So one of the things I did was I asked myself the question, how did it come to this that I regard freedom as so important? And it's a very, in a way it sounds like a convoluted story, but I wrote it down as I experienced it. And I start with a story of a magician that my brother and I encountered when I was about 9 years old or something in Brenton-on-Sea. And this magician was able to bamboozle us. And like kids do, we were not satisfied with one evening. We sat there every evening and try and catch him out. And of course, loved the fact that he continued bamboozling us.
Right.
That and similar incidents brought home to me the idea that I love the idea of the counterintuitive, of someone who seems to be able to do that which is impossible. It appeals to me on a certain it resonates with a very deep psychological need inside myself.
Right.
So proving that which seems to be impossible. I also, to my salvation perhaps I should say, that I see that as ultimately working for the good. You know, that which is impossible is often that which is good, desirable in the world. So, for example, I am in love with a whole variety of inventions which nobody anticipated would be there and would be so simple.
And they almost seem too good to be true.
They almost seem too good to be true. And yet we know they are not. Like evolution is one. It's not an invention, it's a discovery. But it's a wonderful, beautiful, elegant theory.
Simple theory.
It's a simple theory, and it explains the development of species. Isn't it wonderful that genius of a man could sit in 100 years or more ago and actually figure this out by sitting on his ship riding from island to island.
And even more miraculous that it's then accepted. I mean, that's another miracle.
It is eventually accepted. I know there are still people who say the earth is flat, so there are people who say that species didn't develop that way. Yeah. Let's not go there.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that, and the discovery of the decimal system, which is so simple and so beautiful. It works, and it has a symmetry to it, and it's practical. Right. And it solves a myriad of problems. Or the computer system that we have today, the whole digital revolution, is really fundamentally a simple concept.
I think in your book you even mentioned the wheel.
The wheel, well, how would we do without the wheel?
But I think it's a great example of the simplest, most elegant solution.
That's right.
To such a complex problem.
Yes, and I recently read an argument where someone said the greatest contribution to productivity in the 20th century was the washing machine, which is wonderful because it freed women's hands and they can join the workforce and they can do other things. So it's just an interesting thought.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is that I'm a contrarian. I love the writers who challenge the conventional way of thinking. And to me, that is the ultimate expression of freedom.
Yeah.
It's freedom of thought,
Right.
and freedom of speech, which is a necessary corollary of freedom of thought. The people who are my heroes are Darwin and Adam Smith, and more modern Elon Musk, and in South Africa Tim Noakes. People who challenge the conventional thinking and actually, against all odds, turn out to be right.
So you're saying it's not necessarily that everything that they say is true. It's more just what you admire. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what you really admire is that they question things. They're bold. They're brave in their inquiries.
Yes,
and that's important.
That is really important, because without that discourse, somebody made the very obvious point recently that the importance of freedom of speech is precisely the fact that you can offend people by disagreeing with them.
Right.
Because if you don't offend people, you're not actually making progress. You have to have that dialectic of agreeing and disagreeing, arguing and counter-arguing. Because if we all agreed in a perfectly harmonious state about everything, just think about that for a second, we will not make progress. Everybody will agree on everything, and on all the important points we will not go forward. Because there will not be development of thinking.
Before we move on in the introduction, Frans, do you think in South Africa, I mean, obviously it's a very complicated country and there are many issues, but do you think that that people tend to take that for granted, the freedom of thought, freedom of expression? And I don't mean, when I say freedom of expression, I don't mean trivial expression, but I really mean something like this. So the ability to really challenge policies, what seems like an intuitive idea. Do you think people take for granted that freedom?
I don't think I think a lot of people don't think about it. So that's part of my concern. There's often not thought given to the importance of freedom of thought and freedom of expression. So the result is that it is permitted to go into disuse almost by either neglect or very often deliberately. We see that in our campuses now, where people are deplatformed when they express views which are not part of the mainstream view, and it's a worrying state of affairs. So it's something that I feel very strongly about. We should somehow, we must change. I think there is a bit of a counterculture movement happening, but it's not. It's far from there yet.
Right. I think what makes it particularly hard these days, especially if you're in the online environment like Twitter, or it can be quite overwhelming to encounter an outrage mob and people who are highly offended by things. I know Helen Ziller wrote a few articles in the Daily Maverick about this, about how difficult it was becoming to talk about things,
to express a contrary view,
without being called a racist or without being called a this or that.
Yes, and the irony is that it's a harking back to a less civilized mode of life.
Right.
And the reason is it goes with our primordial tribal mentality, that if you're not with us, you're against us. And if you don't look like us or think like us or talk like us, then you're against us.
Right.
Whereas the period of enlightenment, which is the one I express so much admiration for in the book and elsewhere, to me is what it should all be about. It is this ability through our reason, our thinking and talking, to straddle that boundary between that which we don't know and which is bad for us, and that which makes life work better. And we should have both. I just to interrupt you, I have one of the stories I tell in the book is about my two political philosophy professors at Stellenbosch, Degenaar and de Tooy.
Yeah.
And they, to me, personified those two extremes. Degenaar was a follower of Plato, and he said an unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, embrace the uncertainty, go for the chaos, examine it. And then on the other hand, we had de Tooy, who was the proponent of the principles of logic and taught me that part of the toolbox. And they are both crucial. You have to examine. I mean, you're in the creative world. You always have that process of first going wild with your thoughts, examining anything that comes.
Yeah.
And going for the unknown.
Right.
Even if it's absurd.
Right.
Because that's an important part of contrarian thinking, is tackling that which seems absurd, but then bringing in the discipline.
Yeah.
And it's that dance between the two of chaos and discipline that produces the progress. I think we have to have that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think why I think it's nice to go down this road is because I think that understanding concepts like counterintuitive thinking, understanding basic concepts like logic, being critical. You talk about that quite a lot in your introduction, and I feel like it's important to explore this a little bit, because if you have to be conscious of those ideas when reading the book. I think there's so many challenging, complicated ideas in your books that and they can easily go over your head.
Yes, and also you could, if your mindset is not open to receiving, I suppose it could happen, but it cuts both ways. One of the biggest challenges I've given myself is to overcome what is known as confirmation bias. Incidentally, in that very dinner, one of the accusations that my sons...
The dinner with Daniel and
Yes,
Stefan.
what they leveled at me was, but you only read the stuff that confirms what you believe in.
Right.
And to some extent that's true, because it is just instinctive. It's almost like a dog following a trail. Is the dog going to pursue the trail which does not smell of the track that he's trying to follow, or is he going to follow the one which actually does smell like the track he's trying to follow? Right. It's something like that. So you have to be completely chaotic in your thinking if you don't pursue that which makes sense at the moment.
Right.
It makes sense, and it makes sense, and it makes sense, and then you encounter an obstacle. You run into a rock or a stream that crosses the trail, and all of a sudden you lose the scent. Now, when that happens, you stop and you re-examine the evidence. And if it no longer makes sense, if it becomes incoherent, you stop and you re-examine and you find other evidence until it makes sense again. So that's the way you look for coherence. And I've honestly tried to do that, and I give a number of examples as to my thinking in terms of how you have to have that duality.
Do you think that what's making it increasingly difficult to kind of get people to agree on some of these ideas, or to get people on board, or just to get people to be open to the ideas in the book? Do you think a big part of that challenge is the fact that a lot of the core values or core discoveries, one could say, of the Enlightenment have almost been, in a way, undone by a lot of the postmodernist attitudes that we experience in our culture?
Yes.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, I regard things like reason and logic almost like gravity. It doesn't really. It's kind of universal.
It's difficult to undo, and it's not. Yeah. It couldn't possibly be culturally specific.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
But in South Africa,
it's often objective.
It's often people often make it sound like a lot of an Afrikaner's arguments are culturally specific.
Yes.
Or a white person's arguments are specific to white culture.
Yeah.
Which kind of, for me, muddies the waters. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
No, it does muddy the water. It should not matter. Science of logic has a name for it. It's basically the ad hominem fallacy, which in our society takes a particular form that's not only attacking the man, but attacking the man because of the group to which he belongs.
Right.
And you say, well, but he's funded by Mobile. He is white. He is of South Africa. He's American. And poor Americans, they can't say anything because it doesn't matter what the content is. Take it from whence it comes as the sort of argument. Well, it's a profoundly illogical approach.
Right.
So I don't like that, and I try and overcome it. But I address it. I say to people, I understand. Who the hell am I? And I think it's a fair question. Who the hell am I as a white privileged South African to prescribe to black people what the medicine is that they should take in order to help this problem go away? And it's a fair point. But at the same time, I am part of the problem. I'm here, I'm not going anywhere.
Mm.
My perception of the problem is an integral part of it. If I tomorrow, people like me can get up and go because we have the ability. We are educated and in some cases wealthy enough to
and highly skilled.
Pull up our roots and go somewhere else and take all those resources away with us. So that's an important question. Or we can stay here and we can make a contribution. And I think it's important that we try and do that because we must make it better here.
Yeah. So that's a nice opportunity for us to move on. But I just want to reiterate how, as someone who's read the book, and to anyone wanting to read the book, I would really emphasize getting to grips with ideas like the ideas you discussed, counterintuitive thinking, the importance of philosophy, critical analysis,
and evidence. Let's not lose sight of this fundamental. A very important approach of mine is, and there's always a debate about this. Should you debate this on a sort of an a priori moral level? Just say, let's just debate the principle.
Right.
Or should we debate the evidence? Now, I actually get my teeth into the evidence because I believe evidence speaks to people. People understand. The only thing that is better than evidence is experience. And we can come to that a little later. But evidence, and then you have fundamentally good evidence, which is really not difficult to understand, which favors, for example, free markets. And I try and set that out in the most sort of big picture sort of format. I say let's just step back for a second and look at the totality of the evidence. And you'll see there's overwhelming support for the notion that it's better to move in the direction of a free market than the opposite. So just a simple example, which I always find the two points which I think are particularly convincing. The one is simply look at those countries which have the highest levels of immigration. First of all, when last did you hear of someone, it's now in the news, North Korea and South Korea, someone crossing the border, risking his life to break into North Korea?
Yeah.
Or from Miami, crossing the dangerous water to get into Cuba? It doesn't happen. By the same token, look at the freest markets in the world. They have the highest immigration figures, but by a mile. Why? Because people go there because there are jobs, there is growth, there is prosperity.
Opportunity.
There's opportunity. And they go there, this is an important point, they go to places like the United States or Switzerland or Hong Kong, precisely because there are so many rich people.
Yeah.
The inequality of their society is precisely what attracts the immigrants. They don't go to an equal society, which has got a nice socialist system where everybody is equally.
They aren't going to Cuba.
They don't go there.
Or Venezuela.
Or Venezuela or North Korea, because they don't see the opportunity of getting wealthy and prosperous.
Right.
That's where they want to be. And you can't argue with that. That's the old expression of people voting with their feet. They go there because it's prosperous. So that's one piece of the evidence in favor of free markets. The other one is a sort of an intuitive, almost a thought experiment. But someone once made a calculation. They say, take the pencil. You have a pencil, an ordinary old wooden pencil. And you say, how many steps and how many people doing work did it take to get this pencil to your desk? And the truth is, you actually run out of numbers. It becomes so big.
It's astronomical.
Astronomical. For example, somebody has to grow the wood of which the pencil is made. So there has to be a plantation somewhere, a forest. Then somebody has to cut down the trees. Then somebody has to plane the wood. Somebody has to cut it up into suitable pieces. That's only the wood side of things. Now somebody has to do the graphite, lead. And so you can go on. Then you have to get into the buying and purchasing and distribution and merchandising and retailing, the whole process. Then there's a marketing side of things, and so you go on. In other words, literally hundreds of thousands or millions of people doing hundreds of thousands or millions of little steps.
Right.
And miraculously, it lands on your desk cheaply.
Yeah.
Or a hamburger. You can pick up the telephone and you can order a hamburger and it will be there within 15 minutes. Now just imagine the chaos out of which that is produced.
Yeah.
And the cooperation.
Yeah.
The level of cooperation. And you know what? Not one of those people in that chain of manufacture knows anything about any of the others or cares. He's simply looking after his own little corner.
And for me, the cherry on top of those kinds of stories or those kinds of demonstrations of all these steps, the cherry on top to me is that, you know, these are complicated people as well. These are people with hopes and dreams. These are people with kids at school who can't pay the bills. These are people who are not necessarily thriving, but actually having a hard time in their lives. But somehow they're still able to get up in the morning, go to work and get this done, which makes it even more miraculous, you know?
And the miracle is it lies in the system, because the system is able, and if I say the system, I'm talking about the market.
Right.
The market is able to create the incentives to spur people on to do whatever it is they have to do to make this miraculous mass cooperation possible.
Right.
And to me, you know, I spoke about magic. If that magic doesn't speak to you, then I don't know. Now take the opposite. The state. Somebody sits in an office in Pretoria, a bureaucrat or a team of bureaucrats, and just imagine for a second that they now plan that. They plan that entire process.
So they interfere.
Yeah. They don't interfere, they start off scratch. Let's take an extreme example. They say, we're now going to make pencils and get them to all the people.
And no one else is allowed to make pencils.
Yeah, we will make them. Now, is it a surprise that in the countries, the satellite communist countries, people queued for literally years to get a motor vehicle or a bed or a flat?
Or even a loaf of bread. I mean, a lot of people don't realize I don't know if it's in your book, but there's this wonderful story of someone traveling from the USSR to London at some point during the communist era, and being taken on a tour of London and obviously totally different to the USSR, and at the end of the day, he had one question. It was something like, where are people lining up to get their bread? And the person taking him on the tour said, that's absurd. No one queues for bread.
In fact, the bread follows you.
Yeah.
It almost comes nowadays. It's literally true. I mean, you look at all the internet services that pursue consumerism actually seek you out and say, we know that this is something that will interest you. Do you want more of that because you ordered it last time, and so on. So it's become that extreme now and convenient. So I believe it's a miracle, and let's just go back a step. Mm-hmm. At the bottom of all this is freedom.
Right.
Fundamentally, it is freedom, because the opposite is state intervention, and that means, by definition, a limitation of freedom.
So do you think that younger people's leanings towards, like Stefan and Daniel that night in the restaurant when they demonstrated their beliefs, do you think these kind of leanings towards socialism we see with young people, and I've experienced it myself in my circles, does it have something to do with taking the magic tricks for granted, not really understanding the scope of the system? Or because for me that seems to be the case. It's almost like we've become we've acclimatized, and we don't actually see the magic anymore.
Yeah.
And therefore there's no gratitude or appreciation.
It is partly that. I think we're blind. The evidence sits in front of our eyes, and because of the familiarity, it breeds contempt. That's the one. I mean, the same people who complain about these things would happily whip out their smartphone and order a pizza online, or order a new computer online, or buy tickets to the latest rock concert in South Africa, or tune into Netflix and download a film. So there is that familiarity which is bred, I think, out of to a large extent complete ignorance of the miracle that is in fact happening around us. That's the one point. But the other aspect that is really important, and we must address, is that in South Africa we're sitting with this history of injustice.
Right.
So one mustn't forget that. Yeah. I recently wrote a piece where I tried to grapple with the idea. It's all very fine, this free market thing, but when you have this disparity, which is what we introduced ourselves with earlier on, of the haves and the have-nots, right, which is historically founded in apartheid in South Africa, surely that must justify the intervention.
Right.
And it's not so simple to say that it is not so. I mean, don't these people have an argument? Don't they make a point by saying, but you can't just assume that now, because we have abolished race-based legislation, everybody can move on, because the playing field is not level. So we must first level the playing field. We must first restore the imbalance, effect the redress.
Right.
And that's a fair question, and it forced me to go through the exercise of saying, well, forget about whether it works. That's a different question. We'll get to that. But what I had to do is to find an answer to the question: is it fundamentally moral? Forget about whether it works. Is it fundamentally moral to say we should maintain universal right to freedom for everybody and leave it? Or should we interfere in people's freedom? And in particular, we're talking here in the freedom of the privileged class, because it is so tempting. I mean, all the white people took the property and the opportunities of the black people, and as a result of that, they all benefit. So let's start just very briefly unpacking that.
Right.
And it struck me, the first thing that, I can't help but think about this like a lawyer. So there are two bases on which you can claim. Black people can claim the stuff from white people. The one is to say they have guilt. But it's really difficult.
The white folks have guilt.
Yes,
Right.
they have the guilt because they took, but it's not nice and symmetrical, because your generation didn't participate in the stealing. If anybody stole, it's my generation. So there's a whole host, millions of white people who are either immigrants or kids who didn't steal. So that sort of muddies the water. So you say, well, you can't allocate guilt on the basis of groups. That's one of the more egregious forms. That's what the Nazis did. They said, because you belong to a particular group, because you're Jewish, and some of you may be seen to be avaricious or very competent or very wealthy, that means as a group we're going to allocate the guilt to you.
Right.
That's scandalously immoral. You can't do that. So let's forget about guilt. Then you get to, well, but they benefit. You see, fair point. White people benefit. I benefit. You benefit. We definitely all still benefit from apartheid. But unpack that for a second, and now you really run into difficult waters, because you ask a question such as, when the white people came to South Africa in 1652, they were, as the result of historical happenstance, already ahead in the race.
Right.
Now what do you do with that? How do you factor that into this equation of the one was enriched at the expense of the other? White people had an advantage already then. That must have played some part. That's only a start. Most important is if we had a fair system from the start, would we have benefited the blacks with schools? Yes. Would they have advanced? Yes. What would the effect of that have been on white people? White people would have had more trained workers, black trained workers, to work in their factories and their businesses. White people would have had eminently more buyers, bigger markets into which to sell their goods.
Because they already had a head start.
They had a head start, but they also would have had this very wise thing of a trained black workforce, of a purchasing power market, black market. So they would have been better off if they did not have apartheid and discrimination. However difficult it is to imagine that. So I think the point I'm making, I'll make it a number of times, is we cannot unscramble that egg. It's impossible. Yeah. So I'm not going to go into that any further, because I'm quite sure at a later occasion we'll do it. But all I'm saying is it is really difficult to unscramble the egg. Fundamentally, let me just conclude with this thought.
Yeah.
What we have seen in South Africa is we started out with labor laws to try and benefit the disadvantaged.
Yeah.
That didn't work because our unemployment went up. So that intervention by the state into the freedom of people, black and white,
right,
didn't work. Then we had employment equity, affirmative action, to try and redress the wrongs. Still the average poverty of black people in relation to whites went up. Then it went up.
Wow.
Affirmative action benefited a small elite of black people, but the vast majority of black people became poorer because the unemployment went up and up.
Before we continue, I just think that such a little footnote that's such a great example of why counterintuitive thinking is so essential.
That's right.
Is because because BEE sounds nice. It black economic empowerment intuitively seems like a good idea.
It does.
But the unbelievable evidence in your book suggests that it's not. It sounds nice, but the evidence
excellent example
demonstrates that it hasn't brought about the what's the word?
Prosperity.
The prosperity that people said it would, or people imagined it would.
Yes. Yes. Well, employment equity is an example, and labour law certainly is an example, because just think about it. I think there are actually well-meaning people who would say, A, if you lift the incomes of people by way of a minimum wage, for example, then people are going to be better off on average.
Right.
I mean, it's Doesn't it seem right?
It seems intuitive.
It seems intuitively right. And yet all the evidence shows that if you make the cost of labour higher, people buy less of that labour, which means there are more unemployed people. Once you grasp that, you see, well, the intuitive thing is really not right. It's the counterintuitive thing which is right.
And this is where we enter into such interesting territory, because that, like for me, that discovery in your book was one of the most alarming things to learn about. That minimum wage wasn't necessarily effective. If anything, it might actually have there might be something destructive going on.
Yes.
I think it can't be stressed enough how important it is to grapple with the fact that these things aren't. I think the point I'm trying to make is these things aren't simple.
They aren't.
They are very complicated, and for an example like minimum wage, the solution isn't as simple as people think.
And of course, that brings me to another topic, which is the question of simplicity and complexity.
Right.
I have touched on it earlier, but it's a really difficult, counterintuitive battle to fight, to explain the distinction between complexity and simplicity. I get accused of oversimplifying the problem, to which I reply by saying no. The problem is extremely complex, and it's getting more so every day as people multiply and all those activities and problems mount up.
Right.
It must become more complicated. So the intuitive response is to say, well, then the state must really take a hand. The state must intervene. The state must help. The state must plan. That's the intuitive thing. The counterintuitive answer is, which is the correct one, is to say, it is precisely because of this enormous complexity that you have to leave it to each person to work out his own deal with his neighbour. When he goes to the shop, or when he employs his gardener, or when he makes something and sells it on the street corner.
Right.
It's the only thing that works to deal with the complexity, because you cannot possibly manage. The more complex it becomes, the more the state flounders, because it is impossible to manage from a central perch the multiplicity of transactions.
It's even hard. I think what's so interesting is it's not only challenging or impossible, but it's hard even for the most competent of governments to manage those kinds of processes or problems. And so in our country, where there's so much incompetence, it's even worse.
And then, of course, on some similar note is the notion, which is all too common in this country, is the idea that the successful examples of the Nordic societies are socialist examples.
Right.
And the fact is that those societies, if you analyze them, and we'll do that in greater detail later on, are in fact free markets. They are, on the relative scale, they fall in the top 25%. Now, just to place that in perspective, when I say top 25%, there's an index, and I will refer to that a lot, which is the Fraser Institute's index of economic freedom of the world, which has to do with a measurement, a quantitative measurement of which countries are economically free. Hong Kong sits right at the top, and Venezuela is more or less at the bottom at the moment, and South Africa, just as a matter of interest, hovers between, depending on the year, between 85 and 90. Now that is way below. There's 159. There are 159 countries on the list.
Right.
So you can see that South Africa is well below the middle, which makes it a pretty unfree society economically. So I think this is a great opportunity to quickly dive into the definition of a free market, because when I came to your book launch, when I really got into your book,
and was presented with this idea of a free market. I mean, I'm a younger person. I haven't studied economics. I think of myself as someone who's well read, but the idea of a free market was something new to me. And and I remember saying to you at the book launch, I thought surely we are a free market, because when you think of freedom, you think of when you think of something that's unfree, you think of something that's oppressed or in chains, or so the idea of a free market. Can you just?
No, that's a fair point. I think a starting point is to say what a free market is, and then to say what a free market is not.
Right.
A free market is fundamentally a market that consists of two things. One is it has freedom of exchange or freedom of contract. In other words, I can sell my labor or my goods to you at whatever price I will, as long as we agree.
So in other words, no minimum wage.
There's no minimum wage, for example.
Right.
So we have freedom to agree, and the state doesn't tell us that we're either allowed to or that we're only allowed to do it on certain terms.
Right.
So the state is then the sort of counter force that would limit that freedom.
Right.
That's the first leg, is then freedom of exchange, and secondly then freedom to own property and deal with it and enjoy it.
Right.
Which is really topical at the moment with the debate surrounding expropriation without compensation. So that's those are the two legs. Now it's important to understand what freedom of markets is not.
Okay.
It's not chaos. It's still, in terms of how the Fraser Institute deals with it and how I deal with it in the book, it is still a system based on institutions. Okay. So there's room for the state. The state, at the very least, will have to have a law of contract and a law of property to support those two legs. And in order to do that effectively, you need a court system.
Right.
And in order to make a court system work, you need judges, you need a police force, and you need those things. So there's an institutional framework that is presupposed.
Right.
The other one is a money system that's normally run by the state. I don't think that's necessarily necessary, but let's suppose for the moment the state must have a sound money system that is not too inflationary. That's part of freedom. Then a very important aspect which people tend to overlook is that the rule of law, which is really, if I can simplify it, is the rule which says that we mustn't be arbitrary. We must be, everybody's equal before the law. That's really the law, the rule of law. That's an important part of the measurement.
Okay.
So that's what a free market is. It's freedom from interference by the state in commercial affairs, including interference in property.
So you were making a point that a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that or looking to the Nordic countries as great examples of socialism and government, a strong
government
intervention
that brings about all the nice goodies. What people don't understand, that there are a couple of points to make about it. Let's take Sweden as the prototype. It's a very typical example. In 1937, Sweden was the wealthiest country in the world. In 1937, also Sweden was one of the freest markets in the world. In 1937, also Sweden was a country with one of the lowest levels of state expenditure in the world.
Wow.
Now, that is very important.
State expenditure.
State expenditure, because when we look at the Freedom of the World Index, they have 5 broad categories. Mm-hmm. One of them is the participation of the state in terms of state expenditure, fiscal management, those are what taxes you take and how you spend it. And if you spend a huge amount of money via the state, that is a strike down. It counts as an invasion of freedom, because it means money is taken out of the hands of private citizens and spent by the state.
Right.
So self-evidently, it is a very important indicator. Now the interesting thing is, as I say, the Swedish got rich long before they had all these nice socialist interventions and welfare states and so on. So in 1937, they were a free market with very little welfare provisions. And then as time went on, it was 16%, which in today's terms is the same as Singapore or Hong Kong.
Right.
Very, very low state expenditure. That then went up. At that stage, they were lower in state expenditure than UK and the US.
So just for again for younger audiences watching this, wanting to learn more, when you say state expenditure 16%, you're saying it's 16% of GDP,
gross domestic product. In other words, of all the money that is spent for goods and services, 16% is spent by the state, which is really low in relative terms. It has since gone up to over 50% in most of those states. Those are Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway.
Wow.
Now that's massive. All right. Now what happened was it really started rising only in 1960. By 1960, the Swedes and the other countries already had famously high levels of life quality. For example, life expectation was as high and higher than the United States and the UK and so on. And then they started building up this state spending between 60 and 80. And in 1980, they started running into problems because the state spending was very high, but they also intervened in the market in other ways. So they had import and export regulations, they had licensing requirements, they had all sorts of things, and they became unfree markets. And there's famous examples of the Swedish dentist who spends his week on the golf course because it's cheaper to play golf than to work because you have to pay so much tax. So what happened in 1960 was, in 1980, is that they started saying, listen, we better reform this. And they dramatically, between 80 and 2000, those countries dramatically reformed from rather interventionist states to free markets. And today, but for the state spending, which is 1/5, 20% of the score, they are some of the freest markets in the world. And if you take out the state spending, they're in fact in the top 5 or 10% of free markets.
Wow.
So they really, in terms of all other criteria, such as regulation, labor regulation, and most of the criteria of income, imports and exports, and then sound money systems, all of those, they are extremely free. And of course, needless to say, rule of law. They're famously fair societies in terms of law, which is essential. You have to have that.
And now, of course, they're famous for their incredible education systems and
they have all of those, and those are really good. And they, but we'll get to education.
Yeah, get to education.
We'll get to education, but I just want to leave the thought there that the freest markets also have the best and the most effective school systems. So it's not a prerequisite that you must have a socialist system to have good education.
Right.
Tertiary education, there's no question. The private sector is the key, and I believe also with basic education. But we'll get to that.
Get there. Frans, on this point about people referring to the Nordic countries as good examples of socialism. I mean, you've just demonstrated what's wrong with that. But let's imagine for a moment that let's allow people to have that argument for a moment, right? Let's allow people to think that they are good examples of socialist countries, even though you've just demonstrated that's not the case. What strikes me as being the elephant in the room with that is that what makes those countries so unbelievably different to ours is that they have so much wealth, and that is something that for me is what I encounter this with a lot of younger people that there almost seems to be quite a naive idea about how the economy actually works.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk about this, because, and in particular, how this, maybe you could also talk about the entrepreneurship in South Africa.
Yes.
How this links to that.
I'll get to the entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Let me just make this, I'll do it in the form of a challenge.
Okay.
I challenge anyone out there to bring to me one single example of a state that had high state spending, and I'm talking about 40 or 50% of the GDP,
Right.
and got wealthy that way. Bring me one example. And it won't be Sweden, and it won't be Norway, and it won't be Denmark, and it won't be Finland, and it won't be the Netherlands, and it won't be Germany. But go and find it. Bring me one which is prosperous today because they spent that amount of money. And I will concede. So that's the first point. To get to your point about the entrepreneurship, one of the most shocking things which I discovered when I read up on the problems of South Africa was how low our levels of entrepreneurship are. If you compare South Africa to our peers in Africa, which were measured by the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which measures these things in terms of either how many startups are there as a percentage of the economically active population, and B, what percentage of people actually intend starting a business, then you will find that South Africa lags behind on either of those in terms of intending to start a business or actually starting a business. We're about 20% on each of those criteria.
Yeah.
Of 20 to 25% of the average, which means people are simply not interested to start businesses in South Africa, and to me that worried me terribly. I couldn't
Right.
understand it at first.
Right.
Now the third chapter is titled Rent Seeking. I've already explained the rent seeking principle, but what it means fundamentally is getting something for nothing to some extent. You play the system without putting in the productivity, and you get something out which is not commensurate with the productivity that you put in. You get out more. You
Right.
play the system. We all know, we're familiar with the concept. The most extreme example is corruption, or state capture, but there are many others. Now, what I try and show through chapter by chapter dealing with different topics is that through rent seeking, we created a culture where people expect the state to provide. You hold out the hand, the state pays. And it could be BEE, it could be employment equity, it could be minimum wages, and it could be welfare grants,
Right.
social grants.
Can we just quickly say that to someone not familiar with South Africa, there are now more people on social welfare
Than are employed.
Yeah. I just think that's
17 million welfare recipients.
And,
people who actually hold out the hand and get.
And that number may very well go up.
Yes, it may well go up, and in fact, someone has done the calculation of those forms of expenditure, which are state patronage, government jobs, welfare payments, and the like. If they continue increasing like they have done over the last 10 years or so, by 2026, it will encompass the entire budget. It will take up the whole budget. So one would imagine it's going to stop because it's simply impossible to continue.
Yeah.
But just to indicate how fast it has grown.
Wow.
And what that has meant is that we are one of, I believe, it is at the heart of our failure to be entrepreneurs. And then the point is this. I started by saying how central employment is. Now remember, every entrepreneurship, every undertaking starts out as a one-man business. So that's a form of employment, namely self-employment.
Yeah.
And every single employer out there, without exception, was founded by an entrepreneur somewhere back in history. So we had to start the business as a one-man or a tiny little corner cafe or a little furniture factory in the backyard or a clothes manufacturer or whatever, or a farm operation or a stall on the corner. And those grew and employed more and more people. And 9 out of 10 out of those entrepreneurs failed. But the other 10% stuck around and became Anglo-Americans and Bidvests and name them, Checkers. So there were tiny shops, tiny factories. Only way to grow ultimately the employment market is to have enough employers, private sector employers, and those are entrepreneurs.
Right.
So if you don't have entrepreneurship, you are absolutely dead in the water. And I think it's a point that is not sufficiently emphasized.
And I think what's scary is that what's scary about that information is that it's particularly scary if people aren't growing the pie, if people aren't and if people also aren't aware of the importance of growing the pie. And that's something I encounter a lot is the problem with rent seeking and these more sort of socialist leanings is that there's this implication that the pie is a certain size and we must redistribute that, and but whereas I think the approach of the book is what the book suggests is of course that we should be growing the pie, so that everyone gets wealthier.
That is right, and let me just say that at the heart, you're putting your finger on it, absolutely. At the heart of the...
Sorry, I've just got to put the charger in.
Yes.
Otherwise, interruption there. Yeah.
You put your finger on it. At the heart of the problem is this debate between production and redistribution. And all these rent-seeking examples, you're quite right, starting at the top with government employment, or public service employment,
right.
BEE in the form of directorships and so on, and shares that go to favoured black people, employment equity, labour law, and ultimately social grants. All of these are attempts to redistribute wealth from wealthy white people to poor black people. And they are not only ineffectual in that they don't grow the cake. This is a very important point.
Or the pie, depending on your...
The pie, your metaphor. They don't not only not grow the pie, they make the pie smaller per person. That's a really important point to grasp.
Right.
Our performance since 1994 has been dismal. I compared our growth, for example, in terms of per capita income with that of a group of peers. I forget the number, I think 24 or so.
Right.
And they were picked at random. They're average countries. They're not good performers and selected for that reason. It's only picked on the basis that they are of a similar income group per capita to South Africa. And our income growth is something like 20% of theirs, and our unemployment, notoriously, as we all know, is way, way, way more. We have 3 or 4 times as much unemployment as the average country out there.
Wow.
Which is our peer.
Wow.
So we have just fallen behind all the way. The other thing that I want to say is that it is not just the corruption of Mr. Zuma. In fact, Mr. Zuma's period of reign was accompanied by growth in unemployment, which was high unemployment, which was almost identical to Mr. Mbeki's. Mr. Mandela's was a little bit lower, but he started off from a very low base. In 1995, unemployment was 16%, and it grew from there on to what it is now in terms of the narrow definition, about 27%, which is 2.2 million to 5.5 million.
I suppose a very simplistic view would be that people might say, well, the population's increasing, but I can't help but feel that does point to a very difficult conversation. This idea that the further we move into democracy, the higher unemployment goes up. What's going on there?
Okay, let me just deal with the first point about the increase in population. All countries' population increases, but except for a few in Europe, which have now stagnated.
Right.
But the successful societies are all societies with growing populations. The US had a growing population for the last number of hundreds of years. The employment creation always kept pace with that.
Okay.
Same applies to Hong Kong, the same applies to Singapore. I mean, we all know how those countries grow populations. They grow, and as I've already pointed out to you, not only do their populations grow internally, but they add immigrants. Immigrants are drawn to those countries. So let's just forget about this population growth thing. It's in fact advantageous. The more young people you have to work in your factories and in your shops and in your farms, the better.
So the bottom line is,
if the market is free.
Okay.
Then the free markets never have a problem with population growth. They grow and they grow and they grow, and so does the income.
And the employment rate
employment just goes up. There's just jobs for everybody.
Yeah.
The unemployment in those countries that I've mentioned is between 3 and 4%.
Right.
So as a belief, let's not play games. I mean, it's a waste to even argue that. So that is what's happening. The fundamental thing that happened in South Africa is that we had imposed all these redistribution, rent-seeking mechanisms on top of the economy, making it fundamentally unfree, and it went progressively from relatively free to more unfree. And as that happened, the slide occurred.
That's where I think that's for me like the ultimate example of intuitive thinking gone wrong. It's sort of, it's policies with the best intentions that sound nice, that sound good, but when sort of illuminated by the evidence we have now, turn out to not be what they seemed initially. Actually, they seem now to be regressive or destructive in a way. I mean, would you agree with that? Is that?
Yes, I mean, one of the fundamentally intuitive assumptions that people make is that we had a free market in '94 and have had since. Our economy has failed, and therefore it shows that free markets don't work. That is such a common line of argument that it's not funny.
Right.
What is not funny either is that it's so wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Let me just.
Right. Okay. So yeah, and this is, I think, so it's important to make this point that is why we see so much resistance to capitalism, to the concepts of capitalism from younger people, is because of this era.
This is one example. This is one piece of evidence that they latch on to. Now, all of this, I make the point in the introduction or in the free market chapter that we must step back from the wood to see the, not to confuse the wood and the trees.
Right.
Just to get a bit of perspective.
Okay.
So the one piece of perspective is this: in pre-1994, the apartheid era, the market was even less free. It's an important point to grasp. We had sanctions and all of those things. You had the fundamental reason why black people are poor is because they were not part of a free market. They were cut out of the market completely. So there was an egregious intervention by the state. So the market, and if you look at the numbers of the Fraser Institute, the Economic Index of the World, you'll see before '94 we were even more unfree. So we became a little bit freer in '94.
Economically speaking.
Economically speaking. Of course, politically we did.
Yeah.
But economically, a little bit freer, but we were far from a free market. And for the entire period from 94 to now, we were in that area which is around about halfway
Right.
between the top and the bottom, and lately tending towards the bottom half.
Mm.
So that's where we sit, and that's pretty bad. Let
Right.
me tell you, if a country sits there, it's already in trouble. It's not going to make a lot of headway.
Right.
And then, so just for perspective, so we went backwards. The other piece of perspective is the United States one. A very common misconception is that the United States at the moment is a free market. Now, of course, it's relative. It is a free market, but it has gone backwards. From 1980 to 2000, it was one of the freest markets in the world. It sat at number 3 most of the time.
Right.
Out of 159. That's very, very free. Then in 2000, it started sliding. And the most alarming thing is that, you remember I mentioned the rule of law.
Yes.
One of the declining things has been the rule of law. And it declined particularly under President Obama, which is quite shocking. His intervention through executive orders, where you don't have proper due process, as the Americans call it,
Right.
have been quite alarming. So has protectionism, where import and export protectionism, that's gone up,
Right.
which is a bad thing.
Right.
It's an unfree thing. And over those years, state spending has gone up, taxes have gone up. So overall, although America is still one of the free countries, it's in the top 25. In fact, it sits at about, what is it now? 11, I think, thereabouts. But it turned at 18, which is pretty bad. So all I'm saying is, for perspective, don't make me defend the United States. There are things, it's not the paragon of free markets anymore. So that's an important point. And then coupled with that is the whole idea of the financial crash is seen as the pinnacle of free market failure. It is not. So it is.
And yet people don't see the massive failings of socialism and communism as sort of the pinnacle of.
You would think it's fairly simple. You look at China in 1978, when the people in absolute poverty was the rule, not the exception.
Right.
Literally. And absolute poverty, you must know, in terms of the World Bank and other institutions measuring it, is the worst category of that. Is as bad as it gets. I forget what it was at the time, but
it was bad.
You barely have food to eat.
Wow.
It was so bad. They just survived.
Yeah.
And since then, about 800,000 people have been lifted out of poverty. 800 million, I beg your pardon.
800 million people
in China have been lifted out.
I don't think people actually realize the magnitude of that number.
Well, yeah, let's just place this in perspective again. You had complete communism in 1978. Then Deng Xiaoping...
and tens of millions of people died. That's also an important point to make. In enforcing communist law
over the decades. Literally millions and millions of people died. All right.
Starved, yeah.
Now you have 1978, when you had Deng Xiaoping starting to free up the agriculture, which was a small little bit.
Yeah.
And then in about 1980, he started with what he called special economic zones, which are little pockets of free market.
Right.
And he tried them out. And predictably, having removed all these regulations and interference by the central communist state, instead leaving it to an administrator who imposed low taxes, flat taxes, minimal regulation, of course, needless to say, no labor regulation, those places absolutely exploded in terms of development.
Right.
And very soon the public in China started saying, but we want some of that. So just to put it in perspective, what then happened was China gradually moved from what was probably between a 4 and a 5 on the scale of freedom to about 7, which is where they sit now. So they by far not a free market yet, but they have so dramatically moved from a total communist state to a relatively free market that they have made huge progress. And now, just to look back, the per capita, listen to this figure, the per capita income in China for all those, basically 1 billion people, has improved by 1,500%.
That's unbelievable.
I make the confident statement that we have never ever in the history of the world seen such, to abuse Mao Zedong's phrase, such a giant leap forward.
Right.
We have never seen such a growth in prosperity in terms of numbers that we have seen in China, and I don't think we will ever again. It's hard to conceive.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a miracle of free markets, relative free markets. Imagine if they went all the way. They would have been, because that's what Hong Kong across the border had for years. Hong Kong had the freest market in the world, while China was starving. Just across the water sat the little island of Hong Kong, and from 1960 grew their income from $600 it was at that stage per capita to 50,000 or something.
Wow.
This was exponential growth.
Unbelievable.
And the same applies to Singapore, which is also a Chinese society, which was ran in a race with Hong Kong. And now Singapore is, with the exception of the oil economies, is probably close to the richest country in the world.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Frans, we're almost out of time, but something that I thought would be very important to discuss before we finish is what I think is essential in understanding your book and grappling with your ideas. And I think it's basically this idea that your attitudes and your optimism for free markets, it's in no way indicative of a different or malicious value system. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that, and I experienced this from my younger community, younger crowds, is that this, people might look at a book like this and say, oh, this is just written by a capitalist Afrikaner, white privileged male. He just wants to maintain the status quo. He has this malicious agenda. He wants black people to remain, underprivileged. And of course, I know this is not true, but I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here because I know that there are very, very skeptical people who think that.
Of course they do, and I don't blame them. Let me just make the point that the last thing I want is the status quo. Please, can we get rid of the status quo? That would make me really very happy. As long as we do it by abolishing all these cruel laws, which are destroying poor people. But I should say that if I could summarize it in one sentence, people who are allowed to conduct their affairs freely and voluntarily through exchange, from a moral point of view, would always be better off than people whose lives are run by the force of the state.
Right.
Just as a general proposition, if you're allowed the freedom to exchange your labor, your money, your property, that must be eminently more morally defensible than saying that the state must use its force, which ultimately is the force of death, the threat of death. You can actually kill people in defense of a system. And my worry is that the arbitrary system of all these interventions, the rent-seeking interventions of employment equity, BEE, labour laws, and now lately proposed expropriation without compensation. Every time one of those infractions into freedom takes place and it turns out that it doesn't work, the temptation of the state is to use more intervention, and in order to enforce that intervention, to use more force. You see where it goes. So ultimately this cancer of intervention into freedom grows.
Right.
And that worries me. So I resent the idea that my proposal is not the moral one. It is exactly the opposite.
I mean, this for me, this reminds me of the point you made about the issue not being white privilege, which is so often bandied about in the media and dominates our discourse, and which I think is actually a bit of a red herring, because what you say is, the problem isn't white privilege, the problem is black underprivilege.
Yes.
And that for me demonstrates that if someone was to accuse you of being anti-poor or wanting to maintain the status quo, as people say, they couldn't be further from the truth. Because if anything, the evidence in this book suggests that the poor will be the ones who benefit.
Yes.
The underprivileged will be the ones who benefit. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think so. And as I started out by saying earlier on, that our system was unfree for 350 years when we discriminated against black people. Imagine, if you can, that we didn't discriminate them, had not discriminated against them for all those years. We started out fairly. Everybody was equal, everybody went to school. I already said, black people would have been immensely better off. They would have become part of the privileged class. They would have been privileged in themselves. White people probably would have been better off still. But the travesty is the fact that they are not.
Yeah.
They should have been privileged.
Yeah.
The problem is not white people having privilege. It is black people not having privilege. That's the problem.
Right. Because there was already a head start, and even though it's not a politically correct thing to sort of go into, it's kind of an elephant in the room, which I think
it is.
Yeah.
It is so, because and which brings me to another point, and that is, it's very often sheer dumb luck. I mean, why did my ancestor have to be in Europe, where they managed to invent the wheel and agriculture and domesticate animals and so on?
And then where the Industrial Revolution occurred.
And the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. It's just sheer dumb luck. And the reason my skin is white is purely because the sun doesn't shine in those places. I mean, I'd much rather be here, by the way. Yeah. It's far more fun.
Yeah.
But it so happens that I inherit that indirectly. When my ancestors came here, they already had a head start. That's a fact of life. Some people are luckier than others.
Yeah.
How do we unscramble that? We cannot. So ultimately, all I'm saying is give everybody a fair shake, because, and I will go into the evidence. The evidence will show that this redistribution model is never ever going to work to make the underprivileged privileged. Never.
Well, Frans, I think there's so much we could still talk about, and there's so much we are going to talk about in future videos. But I think, and as much as I want to continue, I think that's a great note to end this video on. Okay. So once again, thanks so much for taking the time to discuss the ideas in your book, and to also hear my views. I think that's something I really appreciate, being able to discuss these things.
Yeah, let me just say thank you very much for the opportunity and for the trouble that you're taking, the time that you're taking to listen, and I know you're going to do some more work to get the message out there. So let's be thankful for that.
Yeah, and I think to anyone watching, I think what's important to end on is also just to say that I'm very passionate about the idea that these conversations are just that, they're conversations. So that they're a work in progress. It's always a process of building. You know, so it's not like anything set in stone. We're kind of constantly discovering and learning, and I hope that people watching these videos understand that that's where we're coming from, at least where I'm coming from, in talking to you, wanting to learn. Yeah. Anyway, thanks a lot, Frans.
Great.